Linda Thompson was one of the last people to truly love Elvis Presley, before everything came crashing down. She stood by him when the spotlight dimmed. She stayed quiet while the rumors swirled. And when it all became too much, she walked away. Not out of anger, not out of betrayal, but something much deeper and more heartbreaking. For decades, Linda said nothing about what really happened in those final months. Why she left, what she saw, and the secret heartbreak she carried ever since the day Elvis died. But now, she's finally revealing the truth. And once you hear it, you'll understand why she still tears up whenever she talks about him. Before the chaos, before the heartbreak, before the world started calling him a fallen king, there was Linda. Linda Thompson wasn't just a pretty face or another chapter in Elvis Presley's long list of romances. She entered his life at a time when most people were walking away, when the spotlight had started to burn rather than shine. And unlike so many others, she didn't want anything from him. Not fame, not money, not even marriage. She just wanted him to be okay. They met in 1972, after Priscilla had already left, after the Vegas shows had become a cycle of highs and crashes. Linda was only 22, a former beauty queen with a calm strength that Elvis found comforting. In her presence, he could breathe. She didn't demand. She didn't criticize. She simply stayed. For the next 4.5 years, Linda lived with Elvis at Graceland. She was there when his health began to decline, when his inner circle tightened into a fortress, when the pain, both physical and emotional, became almost constant. She saw the private Elvis, the insomniac, the night philosopher, the man who longed to be understood more than adored. And she gave him something no one else could in that phase of his life: quiet loyalty. There were nights when Elvis couldn't sleep, pacing Graceland in his robe. Linda would stay up with him just listening. Sometimes they'd talk about his fears, his career, his legacy, his daughter Lisa Marie. Other times they'd say nothing at all, just silence, just presence. Elvis told Linda things he never told anyone else. She became his emotional caretaker, his confidant, and, in many ways, his last attempt at building a life beyond the stage. But the truth was, Elvis wasn't ready to be saved. And Linda, as much as she loved him, was starting to break. Because loving Elvis meant watching him destroy himself, little by little. The late-night binges, the over-medication, the constant exhaustion, the pressure of a world that still expected him to be the boy from Tupelo, even as his body and soul were failing him. And so, for 4 years, Linda gave everything. She made excuses. She shielded him. She took care of his daughter. She lived in his world. Until one day she realized she couldn't live in it anymore. But walking away from Elvis Presley wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of a role that had defined her for most of her adult life. And it haunted her, because just months after she left, the man she loved was gone. Gone in body, but never really gone from her heart. In interviews much later, Linda wouldn't cry when talking about the glamour or the celebrity. She'd cry when remembering his kindness, his vulnerability, the little boy inside the legend, the man who once whispered to her that he didn't know who he was anymore. Because for Linda, Elvis wasn't a headline. He was home. And when she walked away from him, she lost more than a partner. She lost a part of herself. Linda Thompson had seen it all, the charm, the warmth, the brilliance. But by the mid-1970s, she had also seen the toll that fame, pressure, and heartbreak had taken on Elvis Presley. And while the world still screamed his name, cheered his concerts, and plastered his face across magazine covers, Linda was watching a man slowly crumble behind the gates of Graceland. There wasn't one explosive fight, no dramatic betrayal. That's what made it harder. The breaking point wasn't loud, it was quiet. 1,000 small heartbreaks stacked one on top of the other, until even Linda's unshakable loyalty began to splinter. She remembered the nights he wouldn't sleep for days, wired on prescription pills and lost in thoughts he didn't share. She remembered holding his hand during doctor visits where no one dared to say the full truth. She remembered making excuses to friends and family, pretending everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. But the moment that finally changed everything didn't happen in front of an audience or during some major meltdown. It happened one night in their bedroom. Elvis was slumped in a chair, half awake, mumbling about old dreams and missed chances. He was surrounded by people, always surrounded, but so devastatingly alone. And Linda, sitting just a few feet away, suddenly felt like she was watching a stranger. Not the man she'd fallen in love with. Not the man who sang to her in the dark or wrote her sweet notes on napkins. This man was fading. And worse, he was refusing help. She tried everything. Encouragement, patience, even silence. But the cycle never ended. He'd promised to slow down, to get healthy, to change. And then it would begin again. And that night, Linda realized something she never wanted to admit. She couldn't save him. She wasn't his wife, his doctor, or his mother. She was just a woman in love with a man who was slipping away. And if she stayed any longer, she feared she'd lose herself too. So she made the decision that shattered her heart. She would leave Graceland. It wasn't a grand exit. There were no cameras, no public statements. Just quiet bags packed in the night. Just one final goodbye whispered through tears. She didn't want to make him feel abandoned. He'd already felt so much of that in his life. But she had to go. Linda didn't walk away in anger. She walked away in grief. And it would haunt her forever. Because less than a year later, she got the call. Elvis was gone. And the guilt crashed over her like a wave. What if she'd stayed? What if she'd tried harder? What if he thought she gave up on him? She carried those questions for decades. Fans didn't know the whole story. The world only saw snapshots, red carpets, concerts, headlines. But Linda saw the truth. She saw the man behind the myth. And when she left him, it wasn't to escape the chaos. It was because she had loved him too deeply to watch him fall apart in front of her. And yet, he fell anyway. That's what she couldn't forgive herself for. Not walking away, but walking away just before the end. For years after Elvis's death, Linda Thompson stayed quiet. She didn't write a tell-all. She didn't go on talk shows to spill secrets. She didn't insert herself into headlines. While others capitalized on his name, Linda chose silence. Out of love, out of respect, out of grief. But behind closed doors, there was one truth she could never shake. A single moment that haunted her more than any other. It wasn't the night she left. It was the morning she found out. August 16, 1977. The phone rang. And even before she answered it, Linda said she knew. A feeling she couldn't explain. Just a heaviness in her chest. The voice on the line confirmed it. Elvis had died. The man she once called her soulmate was gone. And all she could think was, he died after I left. That sentence repeated itself in her mind for years. It wasn't about blame. No one could have stopped the path Elvis was on. Not Linda, not Priscilla, not even Elvis himself. But in her heart, Linda always wondered if her presence might have delayed it. If maybe, just maybe, her leaving was the final signal to Elvis that everyone was giving up. She knew it wasn't rational, but grief rarely is. The regret Linda carried wasn't just about leaving him. It was about not saying everything she needed to say before she walked out those doors. She never said, I'm doing this because I love you. She never said, I'll always care for you. She never even said goodbye the way she wanted to, because at the time she thought she might come back. She told herself it was just space, that maybe Elvis would heal, that maybe, someday, they'd find their way back to each other. But she never got the chance, and the regret settled deep inside her. Not the kind that fades with time, the kind that lingers in quiet moments, in dreams, in songs that remind her of what was. There were so many things Linda wished she'd told him. That he wasn't alone, that he was more than the image the world demanded from him, that he didn't need to perform to be loved, that someone saw the real him and it was enough. But it was too late. Years later, when she finally started sharing her memories publicly, it wasn't to clear her name. It wasn't for sympathy. It was to honor Elvis. And part of that honoring meant telling the truth, including the part where she left, including the regret she still carried. One of the most heartbreaking things Linda ever admitted was that she often dreamed of Elvis after he passed. In those dreams, he was young again, peaceful, smiling, and in every dream, he looked at her with the same eyes. Those searching, soulful eyes that always seemed to be asking, will you stay? And she would wake up crying because in real life, She hadn't. Linda never remarried Elvis, never reclaimed that part of her life. But she never stopped loving him either. And when she finally did speak up, it wasn't to rewrite history. It was to finally say what she couldn't back then. I left because I loved you, and I never stopped. Elvis Presley was a man of extravagant gestures. Cars, jewelry, handwritten notes tucked into flowers. But with Linda Thompson, the gifts weren't about wealth. They were about meaning. And there was one gift he gave her that she couldn't talk about for years. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was sacred. To the public, Elvis's final months were a blur of performances and decline. But behind closed doors, he was still Elvis, the man who lit candles at night, quoted scripture, and worried constantly about his place in history. And he still had moments of deep tenderness. One of those moments came shortly before Linda left. Elvis had sensed that things were shifting between them. He was still surrounded by people, but Linda's absence loomed even before she was gone. And so one night he gave her something small, personal, easy to miss. It wasn't a diamond ring. It wasn't a song. It was a letter, handwritten, folded, unlabeled. It was short, just a few lines, but it was everything. He told her that he understood why she was pulling away, that he could feel her slipping through his fingers, that he wished he could change. And then came the line she would never forget. You were the only one who saw me and stayed. That sentence would live in her mind forever. Linda never showed the letter to the press. She never used it to claim superiority over the other women in Elvis's life. She kept it tucked away, in a private drawer, for decades. Because it wasn't just a goodbye. It was a confession. A glimpse into the heart of a man who rarely let his guard down. And perhaps most painfully, it was a promise left unfulfilled. After his death, Linda couldn't bring herself to read it again for years. Just holding it brought tears. Not because it said anything dramatic, but because it reminded her of the side of Elvis that the world rarely saw. The broken side, the tender side, the part of him that still hoped he could be better for her. Eventually, she did speak about the letter, carefully, respectfully, but even then, she never revealed all its contents. Some things she believed were meant to stay between souls. That letter wasn't the only gift he left her. Elvis had once given her a bracelet engraved with the words, "Always." His subtle way of promising permanence in a world where nothing seemed stable. Linda wore it often in the early years after his death, not to make a statement, but as a quiet act of mourning. A reminder of a life that could have been, but wasn't. To some, Elvis Presley was a legend. To Linda, he was the man who laughed at her bad jokes, fell asleep with his head in her lap, and gave her pieces of his heart in moments when the rest of the world only demanded his voice. She didn't parade those gifts. She protected them. Because in a life filled with cameras and crowds, those private moments were the only real things she had left. And maybe that's why she waited so long to tell her story. Because some love stories aren't meant to be loud. Some are meant to be held close. Until the moment comes when silence becomes too heavy to carry alone. There are names Linda Thompson can say without flinching. Stories she can tell with a smile. But Elvis Presley is not one of them. Even after all these years. After marriages, children, and a life that moved on. Something still breaks in her voice when she talks about him. It's not just nostalgia. It's not even grief. It's something harder to name. Because Linda didn't just lose a partner. She lost the one person who changed her forever, and then vanished before she could find peace with it. When Linda appears in documentaries or interviews, she often holds herself with poise. But when the topic turns to Elvis, the mask slips. Her voice softens. Her eyes glass over. She pauses more. And it's not because she's rehearsing what to say. It's because she's fighting back everything she still feels. And what she feels isn't just sorrow for his death. It's sorrow for the life he never got to live. She once said that Elvis was the most complicated man she ever knew. Charming and childlike, tortured and brilliant. And in her words, you can hear the ache of someone who loved a man the world worshipped, but who never truly felt loved himself. That's what breaks her. Not the glamour, not the loss of a relationship, but the fact that Elvis, even with everything he had, still felt so profoundly alone. Linda carries the weight of knowing how much he struggled behind the curtain, how hard he tried to hold on to the image everyone needed from him, how deeply he longed to be understood, not as a star but as a man. And maybe that's why she stayed quiet for so long. Because how do you explain to the world that the king of rock and roll, this larger-than-life icon, was, in his quietest moments, just a man asking, "Do you still love me if I don't sing?" There are people who have known fame, people who have loved famous men, but very few have stood in the exact position Linda stood in, witness to both the myth and the man. And when she finally did start telling her story, it wasn't with bitterness. It wasn't even with guilt. It was with tenderness. She never tried to make herself the center. She never claimed to be the only one who truly knew him. But when she cries about Elvis, you can tell. It's not about what she lost. It's about what he lost. All the peace he never found. The healing he never reached. The rest he never gave himself permission to have. Linda's tears aren't just about the past. They're about the cruel irony of it all. That a man who gave the world so much died feeling empty. And there's one thing she said more than once. Quietly, as if she's still trying to believe it herself. "I just hope he knew I loved him, because that's what haunts her the most. Not the leaving, not even the loss, but the question of whether he died knowing he mattered. Whether, in those final moments, he remembered her not as the woman who walked away, but as the woman who loved him when he needed it most." Linda Thompson didn't write Elvis Presley's story. She just happened to walk beside him for one of its final, most fragile chapters. She never claimed to be the love of his life, but she was there when the lights dimmed, when the crowds thinned, when the pain grew louder than the applause. She held his hand through the unraveling, and then made the impossible choice to let go. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she loved him too much to watch him disappear piece by piece. And maybe that's why, decades later, Linda still can't speak his name without emotion. Because her time with Elvis wasn't a headline. It was a love story the world never fully saw. A story written in whispered confessions, midnight promises, and a letter she kept hidden for years. She didn't get a second chance. She didn't get closure. But what she did get was real, messy, painful, unfinished, and unforgettable. So when she finally opened up and told the truth, not just about how she left, but why, it wasn't for fame. It was for healing. For herself. For him. For the memory of a man who gave so much of himself to the world. And needed someone, anyone, to see the broken pieces too. And Linda did. She always did. For more emotional stories, check out this video.